Hi, this is Mrs. Chavez. We're starting section 3. We're still in chapter 32 of the building of global empires, and section 3 has to deal with imperialism in Asia and Africa. So in the age of new imperialism that began in the 1870s, the European states established vast empires, mainly in Africa, but also in Asia and the Middle East. Through this use of direct military force, economic spheres of influence, and annexation, the European countries dominated the continents of Africa and Asia. The Great Game, that was a political and diplomatic confrontation that existed for most of the 19th century between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, and it was over Afghanistan and the neighboring territories in Central and South Asia. The Great Game meant closer ties between Britain and the states along her northwest frontier. Britain believed that it was the world's first free society and the most industrially advanced country, and therefore that it had a duty to use its iron, steam, power, and cotton goods to take over Central Asia and develop it. Great Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States were the imperialist countries that had colonies in Southeast Asia. Portugal also had a colony in the region, but had the least impact. Nationalism arose as the result of political movement organized to restore the country's independence. It wasn't until 1965 that all colonized countries in Southeast Asia became independent. The imperialism of Southeast Asia was mainly influenced by the amount of trade that was taking place between India, Southeast Asia, and China. Many countries like Great Britain wanted to expand their trade, so colonizing in Southeast Asia allowed them to have safer and more efficient trade routes. In 1884, the scramble for Africa was at full speed. 13 European countries and the United States met in Berlin to agree to the rules of African colonization. From 1884 to 1914, the continent was in conflict as these countries took territory and power from the existing African states and peoples. The Europeans called Africa the Dark Continent because it was an unknown place to them. This got mixed up with the more sinister idea of Darkest Africa, a place where the inhabitants were savage and brutal. Europeans, after the Industrial Revolution, considered industrial towns and technology to be signs of civilization. Since African peoples did not have these, they were branded uncivilized. These attitudes allowed European colonists to ignore the established African tribes and kingdoms with their rich histories and cultures. The drive to colonize Africa was spurred by the growth of capitalism in Europe, which increased the need for raw materials. Some argue that the abolition of the slave trade in England in 1807 was a catalyst that shifted trade from human beings to raw materials. European nations were competing among themselves to trade with African rulers who controlled areas with vast natural resources, and many exploration societies would sponsor explorers looking for opportunities. Many explorers, like David Livingstone, would sign treaties with the local kings and chiefs and opened up more trade routes for Europeans. The reports sent by explorers gave capitalists the impression that it was uncivilized and would benefit from European domination. The prevailing racist sentiments about Africa can be traced back to this era when explorers described Africa and Africans in the most objectionable terms. King Leopold II of Belgium takes the Congo in 1885 and established the Congo as a personal possession. After a period of exploration, Leopold began to force the natives into slavery to extract rubber and copper and other minerals and export them back to Belgium. South Africa. Cape Town was established by the Dutch East India in 1652. The farmers, the Boers, and later known as the Afrikaners, followed to settle the territory. There was competition and there was conflict with the indigenous peoples, the Khoi. In 1806, the British take over, and slavery was, of course, a major issue. The Afrikaners migrated eastward in the Great Trek, and they were overpowered. They overpowered resistance with a superior firepower. They established independent republics and were tolerated by the British until gold was discovered. Once gold was discovered, then then began the conflict between the Boers and the English over the lands. The war began on October 11th, 1899, following an ultimatum given by the Boers that the British should quit building up their forces in the region. The war was also about Britain's control of South Africa, and therefore its great power status. Although the war was fought between Britain and the Boers, it was not simply a white man's war. With a short break for Christmas and the New Year's, the West African Conference of Berlin lasted 104 days. The conference had come to represent the late 19th century European scramble for Africa and the partition of the African continent. Yet, the Berlin Conference didn't begin the scramble because that was well underway, and neither did it partition the continent. It actually did something much worse, with consequences that would reverberate across the years and be felt until today. It established the rules for the conquest and the partition of Africa and legitimized the idea of Africa as a playground for outsiders. It legitimized the idea that its mineral wealth was a resource for the outside world, not for Africans. Finally, it legitimized its fate as a matter that it was not to be left to the Africans to decide. A good example was the British South Africa Company. This company was based in London under a royal charter assigned to Cecil Rhodes. The major objective was to get commercial and administrative rights in South Central Africa. The charter was initially granted for 25 years, and then it was extended for a 10-year period in 1915. The primary function of these private charters was to take the risk of putting in the infrastructure of modern capitalism, including railroads and things like that, running water, sewer systems, putting these into the South Central Africa for the benefit of the British, but without the cost falling on the British taxpayer. Unlike normal companies, the charters established political administration with a military police force in areas where it was granted rights by local rulers. It was also allowed to profit commercially through its own operations or by renting out land. The British government guaranteed the charter a monopoly where it operated and supported it with military against any rival European power or local rebellions. The consent of local African rulers was frequently misrepresented or ignored, with the company operations consisting of blatant acts of military conquest. In effect, the profits earned by Cecil Rhodes and his associates from established Southern African diamond and gold interests were reinvested in the charter and in the conquest of other regions of Africa where land was looted, where land was taken, cattle was looted, gold and other minerals and assets, and the labor of the Africans were being exploited.